You should be seeing the same thing. You'll be live soon.
Yep.
Well, good afternoon and good morning to some of us here in this room. I'm super excited to bring this opportunity to you today. I know we got a little bit of feedback. So before we move forward, I want to welcome to the stage Dr. Shawn Ginwright, who will be our keynote speech for the day. Just some room norms here for us. Please, if you have questions that you would like to put in the chat, not the Q&A button, but in the chat. So as Dr. Ginwright goes through his presentations, feel free to put down any questions that you may have in the chat. Hello, Fran Anderson. So just to be sure, making sure that you all will be able to do that. Again, questions in the chat box here. So I'm not going to take up any more time. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome to the stage Dr. Shawn Ginwright on healing-centered engagement in a post-COVID world. Dr. Ginwright, it's yours.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Sergio. It's really an honor for me to be here as you kick off and get ready for the summer. It is a lot to talk about. It's a lot that's going on in our communities and in our schools, and it's so important that we have the right tools and the right awareness to really support our young people and families during this special time. I want to talk today about healing-centered engagement. And we are, as a society right now, we are at an awkward place. I've been saying that as a society, we are sitting directly between trauma on one hand and transformation on the other. And that our roles as youth development professionals, for those who work in schools, teachers, social workers, our role is to support our young people and our families and communities in ways that move our society from trauma, which is called healing, and into transformation. And that means that the rules that we had before COVID, the ways that we supported young people before COVID, while important, we need to do more. And we know and recognize that many young people around the country in our communities and neighborhoods are navigating significant amounts of trauma, anxiety, uncertainty, as are we as adults. And so it's important that we really begin to use the tools of healing-centered engagement in ways that have the capacity to transform our practice and support young people in their communities in ways that are healing and restorative. I want to start today with a story that happened to me some years ago that I think helps set the context of where we are right now. I was asked to come out to a prison not far from my home to speak to a group of about 10 men who had the opportunity to read one of my older books about African American youth. The email read something like this: Dr. Ginwright, we have a reading group of 10 men here at Dwele State Prison, and we would be honored if you would come and speak to the group. And so I decided to go out to the prison and speak to the group of about 10 men in their reading group. And as I got to the prison on a Saturday morning, the correctional officer said that the men that I was about to speak to were waiting for me in the cafeteria. And in order to get to the cafeteria, I needed to follow the instructions. As I met, each correctional officer would guide me to the cafeteria. And so the first correctional officer said, Dr. Ginwright, we're glad you're here. In order to get to the cafeteria, our prison has lines on the floor. And just follow the yellow line all the way to the end of the corridor, and you'll be near the cafeteria. So I followed the line all the way to the end of the corridor, where I was met with another door, and that door buzzed open, and I walked through it, and it shut behind me. Boom. And I was met with another correctional officer. And that correctional officer said, Dr. Ginwright, we're glad you're here. The men are waiting for you in the cafeteria. Just find the blue line on the end, on the floor. Find the blue line and walk all the way to the end of the corridor. So I looked on the floor I saw the blue line. I walked all the way to the end of the corridor where the blue line took me. And I was met with a door, and that door buzzed open. Bzz, and I walked behind it. Boom. There's another correctional officer. Dr. Ginwright, you're almost near the cafeteria. Just find this green line, take it around the corner, and you'll be right near the cafeteria. And I found that green line. I walked all the way around the corner to that next door. That door buzzed open, and I shut behind me. Boom. Something happened, however, when that third door shut behind me. I began to feel enclosed. I began to feel this sense of incarceration. I began to imagine what the men who I was about to speak to, what they must be feeling every day. And I became deeply insecure. And I imagined that the men that I was about to speak to, that they couldn't hug their children, that they couldn't feel the warm sun on their face, they couldn't smell the fresh rain, and they couldn't enjoy the simplicities of life that I had taken for granted. And so I became deeply insecure when that third door shut. So I decided at that moment that I wasn't going to be talking to these men about my research, because they were dealing with something much more important. They were navigating a very difficult situation. They were in prison, and I became deeply insecure. And so when I got to the front door of the cafeteria, the correctional officer swung those doors open in the cafeteria, and I was shocked at what I saw. I had expected 10 men to be waiting for me, and instead there were about 200 men waiting for me in their orange jumpsuits. And they each came up to me. Hey, Dr. Ginwright, we're glad you're here. The first man shook my hand. He said, hey, my name is Greg. I've been in here since 1989. And my heart dropped. Another brother came up to me. Hey, my name is Chris. And he shook my hand. He said, I've been here since 1990. And one by one, these men came up to me and shook my hand and told me their name and the year they had entered the prison. And as I was ushered up to the stage, I realized that I actually didn't have a speech to say. First of all, I was prepared to talk to 10 men, not give an entire speech. And so when I was ushered up to the stage and put behind the podium, I made the decision not to talk to them about my research, but to speak to them with my heart about what was going on in my life, about the challenges I was having raising a 6-foot son in Oakland and having concerns of the police or aging parents. And I just talked to them for a while. And one of the things I said is that you are not what brought you here. And no matter what you do, there's always a possibility of healing. And I talked to him a little bit longer, and after about 15 minutes, I was ushered off the stage, and I was greeting the men, and that there was time for them to go back to their cells. And as I was walking out of the cafeteria, I heard this loud, booming voice behind me, and the voice said, "Hey, Dr. G." And I turned around, and I was like, "Who was that?" And so I realized that it was one of the inmates. I turned around and he said, "Hey, Dr. G, I just want to let you know that those words that you shared with me were really, really important. I'm glad I really needed to hear that." And I'm like, "Man, I'm glad you whatever I said helped you." And he said, "No, I need you to really understand something, Dr. G, right? It's hard living in a place like this. Not long ago, I got in a fight because people think I'm a threat and I'm really a teddy bear. And there's something that you said that really resonated with me." And he said, when you said that there's always a way to heal no matter what we've done, it reminded me that this is something that I do every day. And I asked him, "Well, what is it that you do every day?" And he reached into his pocket and he opened up a small bottle, and he opened up the bottle and he blew bubbles. And the bubbles floated over my head, right? And my first thought was, did this brother just blow bubbles in my face, right? And then he said something I'll never forget. He said, when I was a child, my father used to take me to the park and he would buy me bubbles, and we would blow bubbles. And so I blow these bubbles every time I blow these bubbles, I heal. I feel better. It makes me and allows me to survive and thrive, and sometimes thrive even in a difficult place like this. And as he shared his story about the bubbles, I became deeply curious. I became deeply curious about our bubble stories. And so as I left that afternoon, the prison, I became really curious about what are our bubble stories? How do we heal in a very difficult situation? And I think that's where we are right now as a society, that we are in a difficult situation. And I'm not sure our schools, our after schools programs, our teachers, our social workers have bubble stories. In other words, what practices do we have? What strategies do we have? What tools do we have to actually create healing in a challenging and difficult context and situation? So what is that context? Right, let's set the context of where we are as a society. The man that I spoke to, his context was prison, and it was difficult. But even in that context, he was able to find a way to restore himself on an ongoing basis. But the context that we're in is different. We're not bound by prison guards, bars, or cinder block walls. But we are experiencing increasingly amounts of trauma and anxiety. The events of 2020, we all know, all too familiar, that the recent anniversary of Mr. Floyd's death in Minneapolis, and the unfortunate, it's becoming more and more common that we are witnessing mass shootings. There was just a mass shooting in San Jose, not far from me, just a couple of days ago. We know that our healthcare workers are experiencing increasing burnout, the isolation due to the closure of our country, and now we're reopening up. But there's also, while we have that, we also have a profound movement for our humanity, a movement for Black lives and Asian lives, and a reimagining of community safety. And these are the events. This is the context that we sit in. And in this context, there is that possibility of transformation. It's that we need the tools to support our young people and their families in ways that don't reproduce harm, but actually become the bubble stories for our work for young people. And so one of the ways that we begin to think about trauma is racialized trauma. We know, for example, that the COVID virus has disproportionately had an impact on Black and brown communities, and that form of that disproportionate exposure has created significant harm to families and communities and young people. We also know from research that African American communities, for example, are seeking alternative forms of therapy. This is an article that just recently appeared in the New York Times as a result of a traumatizing year. But it is not just African Americans, it's not just communities of color. Some researchers are suggesting that COVID has traumatized everyone in America. And we need to have tools in order for us to restore our sense of well-being. And so here is a way that we can understand the context of why we all need to heal from our exposure to trauma. Most of our thinking about trauma, I know my own training around trauma really occurred through what's called the medical model, right? And this sort of downstream. And the medical model thinks of trauma as really acute acts or single acts that occur that have a negative impact on our behavioral health and mental health. And as a result of that exposure to trauma, there is issues of depression, anxiety, compulsive behavior, hyperactivity. But we also have behavioral health, such as substance abuse and violence and sexual violence. Now, these are important features of trauma that need to be addressed, but it is an incomplete picture. Because if we use a medical model, what we ignore is all of the ways in which trauma occurs in a broader context of our society. The social ecological model allows us to see the ways in which social inequality, such as as I explained to you, the COVID virus did not pick and choose who to infect, but it disproportionately had infection rates on Black and brown communities, largely because of lack of health care, crowding living conditions, and so forth. And so the social inequality, right, and social inequities are another way to understand how trauma occurs. This exists in our institutions, and it also exists in living conditions. And so as a result of a broader perspective of how trauma occurs, we have to understand that it doesn't affect just one, it's not just a one-off or acute act, but more importantly, trauma happens in a broader ecological environment. And so if we think about trauma in this way, then we also have to use the correct terms to talk about what occurs in these environments. I was trained to use the term post-traumatic stress disorder, and we all are familiar with PTSD. PTSD is a term that was used to describe soldiers after they returned from war, and that term accurately described their behavioral and mental health challenges after serving in the war. But that term is inadequate to describe a persistent exposure to trauma. So what happens when a young person experiences trauma this week and next week and the week after that and a month after that, that there's a persistentness of trauma. Now, trauma also doesn't just affect young people. It also affects us, y'all. For those of us who work with young people, for those of us who are running and designing and supporting young people in after school and out of school time, for social workers, we also are experiencing trauma that exists in an environment, not in a specific act. So the term that I encourage us to use is not post-traumatic stress disorder, rather persistent traumatic stress environment. This allows us to understand the ways in which trauma occurs in the environment and not as a specific act. And so when we think about trauma in this way, it allows us to broaden our perspective about how to think about what harms young people and their families. A researcher by the name of James Gabarino also says that when we live in a persistent traumatic stress environment, it produces social toxicity. Gabarino says that just like there are physical toxins, if you could look around your rooms right now, if you're in your office or your home or wherever, maybe you're even in your car right now, but if you imagine that there was lead paint and asbestos where you are right now, and if you were there every day inhaling asbestos and lead paint, eventually that would make you sick. And if you don't go to the doctor and get healed from your exposure to that physical toxin, asbestos and lead paint, it could actually become lethal. Well, Gabarino says the same thing, that there are social equivalents to physical toxins, that if we inhale and we're exposed to social toxins over time, that they will make us not well and actually can become lethal. What are those social toxins? Those social toxins are things like fear, anxiety, uncertainty, shame. All of these anxiety, stress, all of these things exist in the environment. And I'm certain that many of us experience at least one or two of those states of being over the last 18 months. Stress, uncertainty, all of those things were deeply present in our environments. Now, the challenge is that oftentimes young people experience these things and bring them to our classrooms or our after-school programs. And unfortunately, we only have one response oftentimes that we're trained, and that's discipline. And sometimes discipline in this way can actually re-traumatize young people because we are treating or responding to exposure to social toxicity with discipline as opposed to healing. And so our job as youth development professionals then is to provide the tools and supports that young people need in order to heal from their exposure to social toxicity. Here's a way to think about exposure to social toxicity. Remember, social toxins don't just impact young people, but they impact adults as well. We like to use this model to describe how social toxicity has an influence on our well-being as well as the well-being of young people. This is a after-school professional. Her name is Mia. And Mia wants to support and transform the lives of the young people she works with. But she works in a socially toxic environment. And social toxins are like toxic rain clouds that are fueled by things like racism and homophobia, classism, white supremacy, transphobia. All of these things exist in our society and create social toxicity. But unlike regular toxins or regular rain that wets us on the inside, these forms of social toxicity get inside of Mia and have a damaging impact on Mia. And they have an impact at three levels. They have an impact on me as an individual, her stress, anxiety, uncertainty. It has an impact on Mia's relationships, her interpersonal relationships, those who she works with, the young people that she works with. And it also has an impact not just on her relationships, but the actual place and institution where Mia works. It has an impact at the institutional level. And the institution then produces values, practices, and policies that are toxic and go back out into society, and the toxic sort of cycle reproduces itself. And so what we have then is social toxicity having an impact at the individual, interpersonal, and institutional level. And so if we think about the exposure to social toxins at these three levels, then it means that we have to have a response, a holistic response to address our exposure to trauma and toxicity at these three levels. In other words, solving and addressing healing at one level does not solve and restore the entire system. So we could provide healing at the individual level, but the toxicity still exists in the relationships. For example, you can provide therapy and support to a young person who's experienced trauma, but they go back into a neighborhood that is exposed to trauma or to trauma and social toxicity. They're still not being healed at the entire in an entirely holistic way. And so we have to think about responding to trauma at these three levels. And so the way that we respond to trauma at these three levels is called healing-centered engagement, and it builds upon and expands and takes trauma-informed care to the next level. And this is how healing-centered engagement works. I was working with a group of young men a few years ago, using the practices of trauma-informed care and trauma-informed approaches. And we were talking about the things that had harmed them in the past and the things that continue to be challenges in their life. And one night, one of the young men said to me, "Dr. Ginwright, you know what? I come here every Wednesday, but I don't want to talk about the worst thing that ever happened to me. I'm more than what happened to me. I'm not just my trauma." And I was a little surprised. And he said, "I want to actually, create and open up my own coffee shop one day." And another young man chimed in and said, "Yeah, I want to create my own business where I make skateboards." And another young man, and they started talking about their dreams. And so as I left that session that night, I went back and really reinterrogated what it is about trauma-informed care that needs to be built and improved upon. The trauma-informed care is important, but it's incomplete. And so we use healing-centered engagement as a way to really have a more holistic way to support young people with healing. And healing-centered engagement is a perspective, an approach, and a strategy that addresses harm and restores the well-being in systems at those three levels. And it supports young people and the adult providers with their own strategies around healing and restoration. The healing-centered engagement is a non-clinical approach. It's a community-driven approach, meaning that it involves all aspects of the community that focuses on the strengths of individuals and communities. It's a holistic view of healing, meaning it's not simply only about treatment, but it's about restoring the entire system. And it recenters culture and identity as a central feature in our healing. So here are some ways to sort of think about the distinctions between trauma-informed care or trauma-informed approaches and healing-centered approaches. While trauma-informed may ask what happened to you, as I was doing with the circle of young men, healing-centered asks what's right with you. It's a strength-based. While trauma-informed care may focus on episodic harm, an event that happened, healing-centered has an awareness of the ways in which trauma and social toxicity has an impact in the environment. Trauma-informed care generally uses a clinical individual approach, and as I said, healing-centered engagement focuses on the environment and is a community-driven response to address trauma. And lastly, healing-centered trauma-informed care focuses on treating clients, young people, youth, and their families. But healing-centered engagement departs because it also provides support for the providers to address and support them with their own healing. And so when we talk about one of the things I've learned over the past is that adults who are experiencing anxiety, trauma, stress, uncertainty, it's really difficult for the adults to actually provide hope and healing for young people if in fact they are dealing with their own issues. And so building the systems and strategies and tools of support for the adult providers adds an additional layer of holistic support for the systems that need to support young people. And so when we talk about healing-centered engagement, it means figuring out how to use these practices even with your own staff. And so instead of jumping into the next agenda, for example, you may have an hour meeting. You might want to have 10 minutes to do a social emotional check-in with your staff. It means that we begin to use small sort of spaces where we begin to build the opportunity for the adults in our systems to actually process and build their own social emotional learning and social emotional growth. So how do we actually begin to integrate healing-centered engagement, and how might it look in our own organizations and systems? The first idea is that first we have to think about individual addressing healing-centered strategies at the individual level. This means, what are you doing and how are you supporting your individual staff members and young people? The second is the interpersonal. What are the relationships that exist in an institution? And third, at the institutional level, which are the policies and practices that actually may cause harm in the first place? So healing-centered engagement rests upon 5 principles. And those 5 principles we call karma: culture, agency, relationships, meaning, and aspirations. And so I'm going to quickly go over each of those principles. I'm not going to go too deep into them, because if you want to actually, I'll give you an opportunity to explore our healing-centered engagement certification, where you'll have an opportunity to go deep on each of those modules and really have an opportunity to explore how these modules might fit and work in your own work with young people. So very quickly, culture is really about focusing and identifying and developing an awareness of one's own and others' racial and other social identities. This means, who are you? What does it mean to be white and working in a community of color? What does it mean to be a person of color and working in a predominantly white community? It means that we place identity at the center of our conversations and engagement. Why is this? The research shows that oftentimes identities are one of the first things that are affected and are impacted by social toxicity. We develop shame, we develop embarrassment, we develop a number of anxieties as a result of attacks on our identity. All we need to do is look at society and what's happening right now in our Asian AAPI community or the African American community. That identity is one of the ways in which our communities become traumatized. And so it's important to center our identities as a central feature in our healing process. The second is agency. The research on agency says that when people are engaged in actually addressing the issues that affect them, that engagement in and of itself is healing. And agency is the ability to act and create and respond to challenges that we see in our society, or we see in our schools, or we see in our neighborhoods and communities. It means that we actively engage young people in ongoing political education, meaning we have a deeper understanding of what's happening, and it provides opportunities for deeper civic engagement. It means it's not just volunteering, but it is also not just volunteering as a form of civic engagement, but it's really trying to improve and change conditions. The third is relationships. And relationships are really, what we talk about relationships is really from transactional relationships to transformative relationships. And transformative relationships are really the opportunity for us to build relationships as a function of our humanity. It means we build deep, long-lasting relationships built on vulnerability, empathy, and honesty. And this is where we allow our humanity to spill out. All of us have transformative relationships in our lives. If you can think about someone that you went through something with and came out on the other side, that's a transformative relationship. So in our work with young people, we begin to think about forming transformative relationships as we engage and create the conditions for our staff and for our young people to create these kind of relationships with each other. Now, one of the things I learned just a couple of days ago when I was doing a similar talk is one of the questions was, as a supervisor, I don't feel comfortable being vulnerable and honest and empathetic with my staff. I just want them to do their jobs. I want them to have transformative relationships with their young people, but not necessarily with each other. And so I hope you guys understand the question here. So he said that I want my staff to have transformative relationships with young people, but they don't need to have transformative relationships with each other. And so that's a problem, right? So in order to have transformative relationship, it means simply that we're being human with each other. And if you have a culture in your organization where you're having transactional technical relationships, but you expect to show up as human and compassionate and empathetic with young people, it's very difficult. So this is why we look at these 5 principles and creating the conditions at 3 levels: individual, interpersonal, and institutional. The 4th principle is meaning, and I'm going to kind of go quicker because I think I'm running out of time, and I can't see all of the bells and whistles that tell me how much time I got, so I'm just going to keep going here. But meaning is really about, why do we do this work, right? What is it that brings us meaning, and why are we engaged? This is our why question, because oftentimes, because of the fast timelines that we have to create a program, that we have to develop budgets, just a day-to-day grind, that we actually lose why we're actually engaged in this work. Meaning means that we actually are asking ourselves questions and asking our young people questions about, what is it that you want to do with your life? What are you really good at? What are your assets? So when we talk about meaning, it means that we actually make explicit the strengths and assets young people bring to our organizations. But it also means that we ourselves are engaged in conversations about what assets we bring to the work. This, again, might look like in your next staff meeting, having time for people to identify their own assets. Like, what do you think you're good at? What do you think? Mary is good at, right? It's just a way that we begin to center meaning in our ongoing work. And the last is aspirations. And aspirations is important because this is based on our ability for us to see the possible future. This is based in hope theory. And this is exactly what the young men that I was working with shared with me, that they don't always want to talk about or only talk about the worst thing that happened to them, but that they heal themselves when they have a vision of their own future. And so this is an exploration of possibilities for our lives and the lives of young people, and accomplishing goals for collective well-being. When young people can see into the future and have the pathways, the opportunities, and supports to achieve what they dream about, just that process of engaging that becomes a holistic way of restoration and healing. I'm going to quickly provide an example, and then I'm going to conclude. But I don't see the chat, everyone. So if somebody is keeping time here, I can see the chat now. All right, I can see it now. So I know that Sergio said that he's going to send me a chat when I have about 5 minutes. So I can see the chat now. So, all right. So here's a quick example from about relationships, right? Our 3rd principle, which is the transformative relationships. And this is, again, transactional relationships are defined by role, position, authority, title, where transformative relationships are built on empathy, trust, vulnerability, intimacy, transparency, care. These are transformative relationships. And so this is an example of a community here in California called North Richmond that had per capita the highest homicide rate in California. And for years and years and years, the city would respond to that homicide rate by hiring more police officers, until one day the city manager decided to try something different, because the increase in police officers did not have a reduction in homicide rates. In fact, there was a negative relationship. So they went to a community youth development professional. His name was Devone Bogan, and Devone had an amazing idea that he wanted to he wanted to hire credible messengers who themselves had gone to prison, and to train them to develop transformative relationships with young men who carry guns. That was his idea, and have the city pay for it. And at first they laughed him out of the city hall, but eventually they came around and they developed what's called the Office of Neighborhood Safety. And so these are taken off of their websites. If you can look at these values and beliefs that they hold, these are the five values of the Office of Neighborhood Safety in Richmond. Victims and perpetrators of gun violence and their families members are people of value and worth. The power of love and listening can turn lives around. Trusting relationships can heal people. Goodwill influences people. Relationship is an intervention, and the intervention is the relationship. So they're really focusing on the quality of relationships in how they support young people. This is what they do. They're hired to go and talk to young men who are hanging out. They know they know the young men who carry guns, and they have conversations with them. And in these conversations, there are like conversations about how they're doing, not about they shouldn't carry guns. In fact, they tell them, they don't say you shouldn't carry a gun. They just want to develop the relationship, because if they have the relationship, then they have the ability to actually influence their decision making. And so they're trained to use and engage and talk to the young men that they work with and say, and tell them I love you. Now, I know that sounds weird, right? So this is Joe. And when I actually went to study the program, Joe left a group of young men and he said, hey, y'all, you know I love you, right? And then I asked him about why he said that. And he said, you know, we say I love you, dude. And I really mean I don't want anything to happen to you. And they see me as Uncle Joe. And every conversation I have ends with, hey, man, you know I love you, man. I just want you to be alive and free. And so they're trained to say, I love you to these young men. Now, at first, the young men respond like, yeah, whatever. But over time, they believe them because the credible messengers show up and actually have a positive impact on their life. So much so that these relationships over time, in 2009, they had 45 homicides in this neighborhood. But because of the intervention of these transformative relationships, the city of Richmond, or North Richmond, was able to reduce its crime rate by 2014 down to 12, only 12 gun-related incidents. So we could see that these transformative relationships have a profound impact on how we engage young people and the impact that they can have in our community. And so you might want to think about what to do next, right? There are ways that you can learn more about healing-centered engagement and how to integrate it into your own organization work. I hope this works. If you hold up your phone to that QR code, you'll get more information about our healing-centered engagement certification. We want to have everyone that is working with young people in this country using healing-centered engagement in their work. And this certification program is a strategy and a way that you can build your skills, your awareness for your team, your organization, or just for yourself to have a transformative impact on young people using healing-centered engagement approach. I'm going to pause there, and I think Sergio will open it up for Q&A. Is that okay?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Dr. Ginwright. So we really appreciate, I'm like mind blown throughout this whole presentation, so thank you. I do want to open it up to our partners here for any questions on what we've just spoken to. We might be on a little bit of a lag, but I just want to make sure that I open it up and give our partners an opportunity to ask any questions.
Sergio, am I still screen sharing or is it stopped?
You stopped, sir. Yep, you're
okay.
good.
All right.
Yeah. I think I know a lot of people have been putting in the chat that they're very interested about how to go through this certification process. And so I know that you had put that QR code. I don't know if there's anything that we can put in the chat as well, a link that people can just click on quickly to be able to learn more about the certification process. Sure,
I could put if I don't know if Deb's on, but I could put something in the there'll be a
I got it, Dr. G.
I got it.
Great. So yeah, Fran is asking how can we take, there we go. We put that in the chat for you all to be able to take the certification. It's listed there. And the QR code were perfect. So Dr. Ginwright, I want to go ahead and start and ask the question. One of the things, did I miss the cost of the course? Is Janet is asking one of the things. I believe it's all in that link now that you can take a look at, Janet, and so you can be able to see what those costs are associated with the certification process. So one of the things I wanted to ask that I heard, and for me, I'm coming from my perspective, Dr. Ginwright, is this idea of language. For me, language is so important in the work that we do in this youth engagement space. I'm curious to know what your mindset changes or was when you had to really think about the language that you were using. Does that make sense? Do you understand the question I'm asking? Can you maybe
Absolutely.
go through that process, like for you, in that language shift?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Sergio. So, I think, our values are enshrined in the language that we use, right? So if we say things like violence prevention, then that means what we're trying to do is prevent violence. But violence is not, we don't want only reduction in violence. We actually want increased peace. We want harmony. We want loving, caring relationships. But if we focus on violence reduction and we get it, the absence of violence doesn't constitute peace. Neither does the absence of illness. Just because you're not ill doesn't mean that the absence of illness doesn't constitute health and well-being. And so the language that we use, I think, is significant and important in our thinking about how we actually support young people. And so the trauma-informed care approach, while it's important, I'm not discounting that. It is important to address acute forms of trauma that individual young people have, and we need institutional supports, and we need an awareness of how to support young people. Yet, sometimes we also need a more holistic view, which is around healing. And so the language of healing-centered engagement allows us to actually name and say what we want, right? It focuses on, we actually want healing and restoration, and not only just a focus on the worst thing that happened to me. And so the language becomes a more holistic way that really defines how we see our engagement, our practices, and with young people and their families.
Thank you for that. So I want to go to the chat. Damon asks the question, are there any stipulations that would discriminate against our formerly incarcerated brothers and sisters? Is this to participate in this practice? I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but let me just ask it again.
Yeah, I could respond either way, right? So no. In fact, we have a group of formerly incarcerated brothers and sisters right now that are taking the certification. And these are formerly incarcerated brothers and sisters around the country that are working deeply in communities with young people. And one of the things that we've learned in working with the formerly incarcerated brothers and sisters is they came to us and said, we got trauma too. And so we're working in neighborhoods. We're working at the Boys and Girls Club. We're working in the after school program. We're working out in the streets, and it's important. But man, we got trauma that we may be out of prison, but there's stuff that happened to us too. And we don't really have a space. We don't have the tools. We don't even have the language. We don't have the trust. We don't have the community to deal with what happened to our trauma. So even though I'm out there working with young people, I still have stuff to deal with. And so this group of formerly incarcerated brothers and sisters are going through the certification because they recognize that, one, they want these tools and they want the certification, the piece of paper, but more importantly, they want to be able to work through and have the tools to deal with things that affect their own sense of well-being.
Thank you. April Bowman is asking, what is the name of the program example shared in California in your presentation? She's curious to know.
Yeah, it's called the Office of Neighborhood Safety in Richmond, California.
Thank you. And then Damon just quoted, instead of a war on poverty, they create a war on drugs. The police can brother us, Tupac Shakur is whom he's quoting. So thank you for that. Are there any more questions or comments from our partners out there in video land and virtual land? So one of the things I do also want to ask as we kind of round things out is, you know, as we mentioned, we are in this post-COVID world and a lot of the stuff is happening virtually. Can you speak to how to maybe make those connections in this virtual space if we're still in some of these places where we're not actually able to have that kind of in-person connection? And can you speak to that a little bit more about where that might, how we can maybe manage that in this virtual experience?
Yeah, it's Sergio. It's a really great question. Like, how do you cultivate transformative relationships? How do you have show and develop sense of empathy? Like all of these sort of characteristics of human connection. How do you do that using a computer screen right here, right? How do you do that, right? And it's a challenge, right? It's not easy to do. But what I've learned and what I've seen is that the same principles apply. And here are the three principles that I think can be used to create those relationships. The first, create safety, right? And safety is create safety by allowing people to have some agreements about how they're going to show up, right? That's one. Second is allow people to share their story. Not their work story, not how they got the position, but their story about their lives. Like, who are you and how did you get there? And so giving people the space to share something about themselves that is not evident is deeply important around creating that trust. And here's why, Sergio. When you say something and first, if you have the safety, but when you share something that's sacred to you, personal to you, when you share that, it gives others the permission to do the same because now they feel safe. And once you share that and someone else shares that, you've created a sacred bond of trust. Sergio told me this. Wow, he must really trust me. So I'm going to really trust him. So that's the second thing, is just really creating the sharing that story. And then the third thing is can do it more than once, right? Keep the practice ongoing, and it might only be 10 minutes a week or 20 minutes a week, but form that small group. If it's your staff or if it's young people, whenever you meet, create an opportunity for people to share and to have these kinds of conversations. And so these three things, what I found, even if you do it over time through Zoom or online technology, can still create the same environment.
Yes, I'm reading some chats here.
Okay.
LaShonda says, regarding our initiative to engage youth, she's asking the question, is there a youth nonprofit group in the San Francisco area for cross-cultural connecting youth? LaShonda has a great program here in Dallas. She takes her youth to San Francisco to do some like community work. So I guess she's wondering if you can maybe point her in the right direction of a youth group.
I know a lot of them. I'm going to name a few, just a couple right now, but I know a lot. Wow. Okay. United Players, United, and Players is spelled Plays. That's one. Courage, right? Courage is spelled Cur. Courage. How do you spell courage? Oh my goodness. It's not spelled courage like the word courage. Oh, Cury. Oh my goodness. I can't remember how to spell it. Okay, I'm gonna just give the person's name. George Galviz. George Galviz is the CEO and founder of that. And then the last is Nicole Lee. Nicole Lee runs a program called wow, I'm going blank here. Nicole Lee. I can't remember the name right now, the program. It's a long-standing program that focuses on issues of justice, cross-cultural connection, and healing. All of those organizations are top organizations, and they do a great job.
So Sherry Cook is asking, if you understand the trauma-informed approach to program delivery, is it okay to bypass that and go straight to healing-centered?
Well, I think I don't think you should. It depends on what your service delivery is. Like if your young people are coming with acute dispositions of trauma, anxiety, and treatment, if you're a therapeutic organization that focuses on specific kinds of interventions and intensive therapy, I think that's important. But I think what I'm suggesting is that there's another level, right? Which is how do you actually add to that? And so it depends on what your approach is. Many schools, because schools and after school programs don't necessarily focus specifically on therapeutic approaches. And so if you're not a therapeutic organization, I would say that the healing centered approach provides the same kind of therapeutic response that you need, but it also does it in a way that's much more collective. And so we're not speaking or addressing or supporting young people individually, but we're creating communities of healing, like healing circles, healing conversations, right? These are conversations and processes that where young people come together and actually have collective conversations about their own healing and work.
Thank you. And we see
I
that
can see, I got the chat now, and I can see people putting everything in chat, so I'm gonna try to stay focused.
That's okay. No, you do you. I can monitor the chat and ask. So I know that we're about to close out. Is there anything else that you feel, we're here in Dallas. There's obviously a different climate, and I think a lot of our partners are wondering, if they go somewhere, or maybe how can we be at the same level that maybe the work that you're doing in California? How do we make those connections possible, and how do we keep maybe that process going on in those conversations statewide? So I guess my question is, what is the impact, and how can we continue this impact in these spaces to make sure that the voices are being heard and that we're changing mindsets?
Yeah, well, I know that the work that you're doing in Dallas already, everyone that's on this call is doing amazing, transformative work with young people. So I'm a youth worker at heart by my own training. And so I know that it's deeply important, particularly now, that our summer programs provide that space for young people. If we create the summer programs and we don't have that space for young people to have these conversations, in many ways we might actually be adding to their trauma. So I think folks should try as much as possible to have conversations within their organizations and across organizations. Share best practices, right? If you are engaged or register or participate in our healing centered engagement certification, take those practices back to your organization and figure out what it looks like in your organization and train other folks. Talk about what it means to have vulnerable conversations. How do you actually talk about issues of identity and race? So these are the kinds of tools that have an opportunity to actually spread, not just in one organization, but across organizations. And so the work that's already happening, I'm certain, is amazing. The healing centered engagement approach is yet another way to strengthen and support what you're already doing in a much more comprehensive way.
Thank you. And one thing that also was interesting to hear and kind of also solidified a lot of practicing what I'm preaching is this: starting from the self first. We need to heal ourselves first. We need to make sure that we are right with ourselves, because in that kind of karma principle idea, I'm also using the word with K, whatever you're putting out there in positive is going to come back. And so but first we need to do that within ourselves, which is really refreshing to hear in the work that you're doing, is make sure that you're taking time for yourself to heal in this process and to deal with what is happening and going forward, because if we're not healing ourselves, then we are doing the youth that we are engaging with a disservice.
You said it best, Sergio.
Thank you. So let me see what's going on in the chat here. We're just getting a lot of people participating. Thank you so much. Everybody just has been saying great things so much, Dr. Ginwright, for your time and your opportunity for joining us here in Dallas, you there virtually, we're in California. Yes, so Leela just put in the chat, please, our partners, please check and click on that survey form. Please give us your feedback about this particular opportunity that we brought you here today with Dr. Ginwright. Deb as well, I know that we've been emailing back and forth a lot. So thank you so much for this opportunity. We hope to see you soon again here in Dallas. I know there's been conversations, so we really appreciate your time and your knowledge here, Dr. Ginwright. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Sergio.
Thank you. So everyone, just as a reminder, as we leave today, please refresh your browser so to make sure that it is resetting your mics and your videos. Also, please be sure to click on that link that Leela just put in for the survey for this particular opportunity. We'll be taking a quick break. This video has been recorded for you, so you should be able to come back to it and see more information on what Dr. Ginwright has spoken to today. Again, please be sure to make sure that you are resetting your computers by refreshing your browser. We are gonna take a quick break and go right into the rest of the today's session. Thank you all, and we appreciate your time.